Start it again. Go ahead, Rick.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today from across the Atlantic, John McClintock. John is an Irish citizen. He completed his studies as an agricultural economist at the universities of Reading and Oxford. He's lived and worked in 4 African and 4 European countries, and for the European Commission in Brussels. He left the European Commission 5 years ago to write a book on global food security. John is the founder of Action for Food Reserves, a non-governmental organization in Brussels, maintaining that global food security is possible and easily affordable if governments set up public food reserves so no country need experience a food crisis. John is the author of 2 works, his most recent being The Fight Against Food Shortages and Surpluses, Perspectives of a Practitioner. John has turned his mind to the global climate emergency and has kindly agreed to share his view on how to realize the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. He will leave, for the consideration of our largely Canadian audience, an interesting proposal to achieve this goal. Questions and observations will be most welcome at the end of John's presentation. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to CACOR for inviting me to share my ideas with you. I'm very, very grateful indeed for this opportunity, because I know that you are experts in this matter and I can learn a lot from you. I have some ideas. They're only suggestions. There's probably a lot more work which has to go in refining them. But I will present these ideas to you, and I would simply like to know your reaction to them. So when we talk about climate change, I think we need to start with this gentleman. This is Charles Keeling, who was a physicist at the university in Northwestern University in Illinois. And in the 1960s, as probably everybody knows, he went to Hawaii to measure the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And his initial measurements, which started, as I say, in the 1960s, showed that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was rising, and this became the scientific community became aware of this and started wondering, well, what are the implications? And as time went on, they continued to rise. And by 1992, the time of the Earth Summit, of course, it was now a matter of some concern. And that was the Earth Summit in Rio. And a document was produced at that summit, signed by all the countries of the world, the UNFCCC, which basically said, and now some of you will disagree with my synthesis, but it basically said that we have a problem with greenhouse gas emissions. And that was the basic message of that document. Now, time went, you would have thought that having identified this problem, then perhaps the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere would begin to plateau, but it didn't. It continued its rise. And we then came to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and that was perhaps an advance on the UNFCCC because it had some numbers in. The Kyoto Protocol specified that a certain number of countries, I think there were around 40 countries, would reduce their emissions by about 20%. The other countries of the world, of which there were about 160, they did not agree to reduce their emissions. But nevertheless, we can say that perhaps the Kyoto Protocol was a start, and perhaps we could see the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere beginning to plateau, to level off, to become stable. But unfortunately, that did not happen. A number of countries having signed the Kyoto Protocol did not ratify it, and it was all rather disappointing. CO2 emissions continued to rise year on year until we got to 2015, and all the nations of the world then signed this Paris Agreement, which was heralded as a major step forward, a game changer, which would resolve this problem of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, unfortunately, that Paris Agreement was, in my view, and again, some people might disagree with this, in my view, it was a step back from the Kyoto Protocol, because the Paris Agreement did not contain any numbers as to by how much countries should cut their emissions, and it didn't contain any dates by when they should cut their emissions. And not surprisingly, since then, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has continued its relentless and inexorable increase. So these are the measurements of Charles Keeling. This is the Keeling curve, and I think that's pretty much proof that the UN system has not yet succeeded in resolving the problem. And indeed, William Nordhaus of Yale University has termed, many years ago, he termed the UN system as leading us all into a dead end. And I would concur with Professor Nordhaus's synopsis. Now, let's just have a quick look at the average emissions per head. These are average emissions, so there's obviously a lot of variation around these numbers. We find Canada fairly high at 15 tons per person per year. The European Union is at 8 tons. China is a little bit below at 7 tons. India is at 2 tons on average per person per year. So there's some degree of variation between countries, and of course within countries there's even more variation. Now, what do we actually have to do? What should be our task in order to get control of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere? In my view, we have 2 tasks. One is to identify those amongst us who are significant emitters. So we need to identify those people or those families or those households amongst us being all the citizens of the world, who are significant emitters. And by significant emitters, I mean those of us who are emitting more than what scientists might consider to be a safe level, which is, I mean, I'm not a physicist, but I would imagine the safe level would be around 1 or 2 or 3 tons per person per year. So if any of us, and I include myself because I am definitely a very significant emitter, we need to identify all the significant emitters in the world. And the second task is that governments must help the significant emitters to reduce their emissions. And I emphasize help. By this I mean to guide us how to reduce our emissions, to provide advice. I don't think the role of governments is to force us to reduce our emissions or to bamboozle us, but they must help us to reduce our emissions over the next, say, 10 or 15 years. So those are our tasks, to identify those citizens in the world, wherever they may be in Canada, they may be in Europe, they may be in India, they may be in New Zealand, to identify those amongst us who are significant emitters and to tell us how much we are emitting and that we are contributing to the cause of the problem, and then that our governments must help us to reduce our emissions. Now, let's think how might this work in Canada? In Canada, there are numerous activities taking place, what I call emitting activities. Aeroplanes are flying around the country, little vehicles are traveling up and down the roads, houses are being heated, and the people inside are cooking with natural gas. So there are plenty of emitting activities taking place in Canada, and these activities are all undertaken by the Canadian population. So let us assume, for the sake of this illustration, that the Canadian population consists of 3 citizens. And here they are. There's Abdul, there's Beata, and there is Charlotte. And these are the 3 citizens of Canada, and they are responsible for these emissions. Now, I won't dwell too much on this part of the problem, but the government, what the government has to do, it has to attribute these emissions to these citizens. And let's say that, I mean, I can explain how this attribution can be done, but let's say that Abdul is responsible for 3,005 tons of emissions. This is basically because he runs that aeroplane. Beata is responsible for 52 tons because she lives in this house here, which is emitting 50 tons a year. And Charlotte, well, she only emits 2 tons per year. So having attributed the country's emissions to the country's population, the government could then identify who are the significant emitters. And in this particular case, the significant emitters are Abdul, who is emitting 3,005 tons per year, and Beata. Now, Charlotte is not a significant emitter. I mean, it doesn't mean to say we can forget about her, but she is not part of the problem. She's not part of the problem. The problem is caused by Abdul and Beata. So we need to consider, what can Abdul and Beata do in order not to be part of the problem, but to be part of the solution? Well, here we see Abdul on the top left-hand corner with his 3,000 tons of emissions every year, and Beata with her 50 tons of emissions, and they are both above the safe level of emissions. And I believe that what the government has to do is to help and guide and advise and encourage Abdul gradually to bring his emissions down, step by step, year by year, down to the safe level of emissions. And this is the task and the responsibility of the government. And the same with Beata. She has to bring her emissions down, step by step, year on year, until she is at the safe level of emissions. And there are various ways in which the government can do this. The government can encourage Abdul to perhaps fly his aeroplane less. Perhaps Beata, because her emissions are mainly coming from her home, she can insulate her home better. So there are numerous ways in which people all over the world can reduce their emissions, and the government has to encourage them and has to say that, in fact, it is their responsibility to bring down their emissions. And the government can provide them with a roadmap for the next 10 years or the next 20 years, say, well, what changes to your lifestyle are necessary, and each citizen can know what he or she has to do during the next 10 years, what changes they have to make to their lifestyles, and how much these changes will cost. So people know in advance, a long time in advance, how they are going to be changing their lifestyles in order to bring down their emissions. Now, let's just think about the economic impact. If Abdul and Beata bring down their emissions, it means that they will be consuming less fossil fuels. I mean, this scheme that I have in mind will cause the demand for fossil fuels to fall. Now, here we have a very simple supply and demand diagram for fossil fuels. This is the demand for fossil fuels will fall. Now, we have a supply curve and we have a demand curve for fossil fuels, and where they intersect, that is the point of equilibrium. That is the price. On the vertical axis is P1. That's the current market price for fossil fuels. And Q1 is the current level of consumption and production of fossil fuels. This is before any emission reduction scheme is launched. But once Abdul and Beata and all the other citizens of Canada and of the European Union and of China, once we start to reduce our emissions, we will reduce our consumption of fossil fuels, and the demand for fossil fuels will fall. And this means that we will go from one point of equilibrium to another point of equilibrium, and the price of fossil fuels will fall, and the quantity that is pumped out from our oil wells will also fall. And this means that the people working in the fossil fuels industry will take a big hit. I mean, they will find that the price for their products falls, and some coal mines, some oil wells, some gas fields will become uneconomic. This is good for the climate, but it's not good for these employees and these companies. And these people who, through no fault of their own, may well be faced with losing their livelihood. And we don't want that. We want people to continue to earn a livelihood, to have income coming in every week or every month. And therefore, I think these people should be compensated. And that, I believe, should be done on a world level. There needs to be a world climate solidarity fund. And from this fund, compensation should be paid to those who lose their livelihoods from the fall in demand for fossil fuels. So this compensation could be something like 5 years at half salary plus 1 year of training so that you can find another job. And the question is, well, who should put the money in to this World Climate Solidarity Fund? And I believe that the beneficiaries of a fall in demand for fossil fuels will be everybody in the world. I mean, and therefore the contributions should be from every government according to their level of wealth. So the EU would make a substantial contribution, Canadians would make a substantial contribution, and maybe the developing countries would make a much smaller contribution. But everybody in the world who loses their livelihood because of the contraction of the fossil fuel industry would be compensated. Okay, so that we don't throw people onto the street. Now, this whole idea of citizens reducing their carbon footprints and their emissions, this might go down fairly well in Europe because we're very concerned with emissions, and it might go very well down in Canada because you are also very concerned with emissions, but it's not going to go down very well with the G77. And the G77 are those countries which one can call the developing countries. They formed themselves into the G77 in the late 1960s, partly, I believe, in response to the rich countries of the world forming themselves into the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The rich countries formed themselves into the OECD in the early 60s, and the developing countries, partly as a reaction to this, formed themselves into the G77 in the late 60s. And at that time, there were 77 countries. Now, in the G77, there are about 130 countries. So it is a very important bloc of nations in the world with 130 countries. And they are in a dilemma. These countries, these developing countries, India, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, because their priority, well, they have two priorities. One is development, and they have been saying since the 1960s that they feel discriminated against and that the world is not run in their favor. The world is run more in the favor of the OECD countries. So their dilemma, well, do they cut their emissions, which are already at a pretty low level, and agree to limit their emissions and to stay poor? I mean, their top priority, and it's quite understandable, is to catch up with the OECD. But if they cut their emissions, they're very unlikely to be able to catch up. Or do they perhaps don't cut their emissions and risk climate chaos? Well, this is a big dilemma, and this is one of the reasons why so little progress has been made in the UN to get a global climate agreement. I believe we have to ask, well, why are so many members of the G77 so poor? I mean, how come this has happened? How come the countries of Africa and Central America and so many countries of Asia, not all the countries of Asia, but many countries of the world, have not made very much progress since the 1960s? And I believe that we should allow them to develop. We should allow the developing countries to develop, which means putting back the ladders which we have kicked away, and stop usurping the markets of the G77. So we need to come to some sort of agreement. We need to come to a deal. When I say we, I mean the OECD countries and the G77 countries. We need to have a deal which is more than just climate. The OECD countries need to put back the ladders which we kicked away. These are the ladders which would allow them to develop, principally trading with us. And if we put back the ladders, then the G77 countries should agree to limit their emissions. They should not. We should try and convince them that they cannot emit an unlimited quantity of greenhouse gases as we did in our history. So, coming now to the meat of my proposal, there are various agreements. There's agreements to put money into the World Climate Solidarity Fund. All the countries of the world must make a contribution, and those countries where the fossil fuel sector contracts, they can have the right to withdraw from the fund. That's one set of agreements. Another set of agreements is the OECD countries have this deal with the G77 countries, which allow the G77 countries to grow and to develop and to catch up, subject to a certain limit on their emissions. And these agreements, I think, should be enveloped in a World Climate Union. And this World Climate Union would be a new organization, but it would be different from almost every other organization in the world, because the rules, the World Climate Union would have rules which are enforced. Now, this distinguishes the World Climate Union from the UN, from the British Commonwealth, from almost every other organization in the world which has been set up since the Second World War, because those rules are not enforceable. And that's why the members don't really take these organizations very seriously. But there is one organization in the world which has 27 countries and which makes law, which makes rules, and these rules are enforceable, and that is the European Union. So I think this World Climate Union should be modeled on the European Union, and the European Union is a sort of experiment, one might say. It's an experiment which started in the 1950s. It's an experiment in international relations, and its purpose was to try and prevent these countries of Europe fighting each other, which they had been doing so almost every generation for 500 or 600 years. And the European Union has, it's not a perfect organization. Let's admit that. There's quite a lot wrong with it. But when it comes to its fundamental objective of allowing countries to live in peace, then I think we can say that the European Union has been actually quite successful. And it's successful because it makes law, and that law is enforceable. And if countries don't respect the law, then they get a penalty. And the penalty is quite substantial. The latest penalty has been Poland has been penalised for not respecting the rule of law, and Poland has been penalised to the tune of €1 million. Now, that's not a one-off payment of €1 million. That is €1 million per day of further infringement. So a few weeks ago, the Court of Justice in Luxembourg issued this penalty to Poland, and every day that Poland does not respect that particular law, it has to pay a penalty of €1 million. And this means that the member states of the European Union take it quite seriously, because they don't want to be paying these rather large fines. Now, this idea of an organization at the world level based on the principles of the European Union, it's been explored 10 years ago by a professor here in Brussels by the name of Mark Corner, and he has a very interesting take on this, because on page 178 of his very short and very readable book, he observes that the World Union could begin with the EU and Canada as its two founding members. And I find that well, very intriguing observation. So my proposal is that Canada and the European Union co-host a conference next year during 2022 to present this idea of a world climate union to all other countries of the world. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is my suggestion, and that is the end of my little presentation. So that is it.
Thank you very much, John. It's a very interesting proposal, and we can take questions now. And I might just kick off by expressing a degree of skepticism about our personal inclination to accept lifestyle changes that aren't forced upon us. In the earlier part of your talk, you were suggesting that governments would encourage, but not enforce. And I'm not sure I know very many people who, having established a certain lifestyle, would be prepared to say, yeah, okay, I'll take one for the world. Unless we can look around and say, well, everybody else is doing it, and I'll be part of the team, and we'll all accept a bit of a reduction together. This also plays a role in the international community. And we look, from one country to another and say, well, why should we be sacrificing a mainstay of our economy, which is the case in Canada with our fossil fuel industry, in order to, make our contribution, when we know darn well that the absence of our product on the market will provide an opportunity for another fossil fuel producer to jump in?
Well, my view is that people will not voluntarily. Well, the number of people who voluntarily, of their own volition, will cut their emissions is probably quite small. I mean, there are some groups who have done this, and they've been studied, and they have reduced their emissions quite substantially. And but not everybody is in a position to do that. And so I think countries have to make it the law. They have to make it the law that all significant emitters have to reduce their emissions gradually, steadily, and the government will help them to do this by providing subsidies, by providing advice, perhaps by providing much more public transport. But it has to be made clear that this is a responsibility of each and every citizen, that they have to reduce their emissions down to a safe level by a certain date in the future, maybe 2030 or 2040. And if they don't fulfill their responsibility, then it may be necessary to exercise a degree of coercion, and maybe they have to answer in front of a judge why they have been recalcitrant, why they have not reduced their emissions, especially given that the government is there to help them to do so. And if they really are, if they really don't respect this responsibility, then I think the government will have to impose a penalty upon them. So but the tenor of the program should always be for the government to help the citizens to do this. The coercion, dragging people in front of a judge, should really be the last resort, because one needs to have citizen buy-in. One needs to have the cooperation of the citizens. And if citizens feel that they are being bludgeoned to reduce their emissions, then one might find a lot of resistance. Now, your other point, Rick, when you were saying, well, why should Canada, make this effort, whereas other countries will not make the effort? I'm not sure that. Well, Canada would take a hit, because your fossil fuel industry would contract most probably, but everybody in the world would contribute to compensating all the Canadians who lost their jobs. And I think that's fair, because we in the European Union, we will gain by a reduction in emissions, because that's to everybody's advantage. But we don't have a very great fossil fuel industry in Europe. There are not very many people digging out coal or digging out oil or digging out gas in Europe. We import it from other countries in the world. But Canada, you do have a very important fossil fuel industry in Alberta and elsewhere. And it's not fair that Canada takes the hit if the whole world benefits. I think the whole world benefits, and the whole world should pay the Albertans to compensate them.
Yes, well, thank you, John. And you mentioned citizen buy-in, and that's certainly important. And one of the functions of these presentations is to spread the word. It's a form of education, and I think that will help with citizen buy-in over time. Now, we have a number of questions. So we're going to start with a question from Dave Doherty, and William Rees will be on deck.
Okay.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. It was great. Rick, I had several different questions. Do you want me to ask them all at the same time, or how do you want to do
Well, let's see. If they're related, if one rolls into the other, by all means.
Well, certainly the first two are closely related. I'd like to make an observation before I start, and it's very controversial, I would say, but I think this is the reality. Professor Rees may make a comment shortly along the same lines as this, although his is posed as a question. If we pose the question, why should any citizen reduce emissions voluntarily? I think that we're making the assumption that the person's emissions could otherwise continue. And I would offer this: they cannot. People's lives will be ruined and they will die if those emissions continue. And it's time we got our heads around that. But to my actual questions, here they are. Would compensation be paid at the same rate to former fossil fuel workers in, let's say, Malaysia and Canada? And secondly, what is the record of compensating people who've lost employment in other industries? As, for example, many conservative governments in many different countries have said, well, there are too many people getting employed by the public sector, so let's cut one thing or another. Like cuts nurses, let's cut teachers, let's cut civil servants, whatever. So what's the history of compensating people? So the first one is compensation in different countries. The second one is compensation in different industries.
Well, I think the level of compensation would vary from one country to another according to the level of salary. So I think, just as an example, employees anywhere in the world, they would get, say, 5 years at half salary plus a year in a training institute so they can pick up some new skills. So if the salary in Canada for a fossil fuel worker is, say, $75,000 per year, then the Canadian employee would get half that for 5 years. But if the salary of a fossil fuel worker in Mozambique, say, was $10,000 per year, then the employee in Mozambique would get $5,000 per year. So it would be proportional to what they're earning at the moment. Now, what was the second question was about?
Well, it was about compensating people in other industries. What's the record of compensating people who've lost employment in other industries? Has it been as rich as what you just suggested? Or in fact, for example, I mean, people used to make what are called featheries. You might know that if you're a golfer. All golf balls used to be made by hand. And when somebody invented a machine that would make golf balls, everybody in the feathery industry lost his job.
Yes, well, I mean,
compensation.
Yes, I mean, there have been whole industries have completely gone by the wayside because of technological advances. And I mean, wheelwrights making wooden wheels, well, they all lost their jobs when, you know, metal wheels came along. So there are cases where people have lost their jobs and they haven't been compensated at all. Definitely. But I think this is an emergency. We cannot have the fossil fuel industry being an obstacle to reducing emissions. And if they're not compensated, they will get very worried, they will get anxious, they will start digging in their heels. And we don't want that. We want the fossil fuel industry to be part of the solution and to help the world decarbonize, and therefore we would have to probably pay them compensation. I don't know at what rate, but I would think, you know, half salary for 5 years plus a year or maybe 2 years at a training institute so that they can retrain. I think that sends the signal that you guys, you've been working in fossil fuels through no fault of your own. This fossil fuel sector has to contract, because we can't keep pumping out so much oil. We can't keep digging out so much coal. So some of you guys will have to leave. You'll have to find a job elsewhere. And we want these people to move out quickly and willingly. So therefore we have to pay them. It seems, you know, so it's in our own self-interest that we compensate the people who stand to lose their jobs, and also it's a moral issue. We cannot just throw thousands and thousands of people in different countries of the world. We just can't throw them onto the streets. I mean, they have to be given a livelihood. They have to ensure that they can feed their families and put shoes on the feet of their children.
Okay, thanks for the answer. Rick, do you want me to go to the other question or come back?
I'll tell you what, how about we come back to that because it's not quite related.
Yep.
And we'll move to Professor Rees and John Hollins, you're on deck.
Thanks.
Thank you, John. You have a very moral view of the universe, one in which people will voluntarily do all sorts of things for complete strangers, thousands of miles away. And in a world in which many people don't yet even believe climate change is an issue, or at least that they should have to do anything to solve it. So I'm very doubtful about the degree of cooperation that you seem to express as being possible here. Look, in the current arrangements, the high-income countries have failed miserably to compensate the low-income countries for the damage already done around climate change. let alone hitting anything off. So that's just an observation. But my question is a slightly different one. You're advocating, and I agree this must be done, an abandonment of fossil fuels rapidly and significantly. But what we're forgetting here is that the economies of the entire world are one-to-one related to the quantity of energy available. And if we were to cut dramatically, say 30% our fossil fuel use, there would be a corresponding loss of economic activity, not just in the fossil fuel sector, but across the board in all of those sectors that depend on energy to maintain themselves. So you're talking about a massive economic contraction as a result of failing energy supplies. And I will just head off some other objections. Wind and solar and other alternative energies have no chance whatsoever, particularly in northern countries like Canada, of displacing or replacing quantitatively the loss of fossil fuels. So I think this is a vastly larger problem than is presented by simply compensating fossil fuel workers. That may be important. I just think the numbers of unemployed, the amount of technical readjustment, structural readjustment in the economy goes far, far beyond that. And no government has given this any serious contemplation. So what do we do?
Well, I agree.
Well,
I agree. The decarbonization of the world economy is a massive challenge, but it has to be done.
all right.
And we have no choice in the matter. And the efforts that governments have been making up to now have been very, very modest compared to the efforts that will have to be made. But I'm not so sure that it means a massive contraction of the whole of the economy. I believe it certainly will cause a substantial contraction of the fossil fuel sector. But other sectors, they will have to change. They will have to be restructured. But I think majority of people will still have jobs. And in fact, more jobs may well be created because human labor will replace fossil fuels, just as over the last 100 years, fossil fuels has replaced human labor. So we will now go in the reverse direction. For instance, people will be using less machines and they'll be using more muscle because, so I don't think it's going to be a catastrophic economic situation. And moreover, but it will require a lot of government planning and a lot of forethought, and it must be made, at the end of the day, it must be made compulsory for all significant emitters, and I include myself in that class. I must start taking this seriously by insulating my house, by not using so many machines in my garden. I must start using a hand rake, perhaps, instead of a leaf blower. But I will have 10 years, 15 years in order to make these necessary adjustments. So I think it's very, very substantial. It's a huge challenge, but I think it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question, Professor Rees, and thank you, John. We'll now take a question from John Hollins, and Phil Riley, you're on deck.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for your talk. I particularly struck in the early going, you talking about Abdul, Beata, and Charlotte. In any other domain, if there were vastly different contributors to a problem, the government of Canada would probably figure that it should be going after the big ones first. I regret to advise that our pan-Canadian agreement on climate change treats federal government, 10 provincial governments, and 3 territorial governments with the same vague challenge of reducing by a certain percentage. So your choice of Canadian government to work with the EU on a special conference in that respect doesn't look too promising. But let me tell you a bit of history. In 1988, the government of Canada hosted a special ad hoc conference in Toronto on the changing atmosphere, which was one of the 2 or 3 signal events at that period that put global heating on the international agenda. So there's some precedent. I have to tell you that it wasn't the same government, obviously, a third of a century later, but if the Canadian government got engaged, seized with your idea or some adaptation of it, it wouldn't be the first time. I also don't fully share your concern about the people who work in the current fossil fuel industry in Alberta. They're smart people, they're entrepreneurs, they're frontiers people, and some of them know that underneath the relatively thin blanket of prairie soil, which is getting blown away far too much these days, there's some geothermal heat. My goodness, and they got drilling stuff that could go look for that too.
Great. Well, that I find that very encouraging, John. I mean, that it means that the Canadian government has already taken an initiative to bring countries together on this issue, and that's good news in 1988. And it means that if geothermal sources of energy are available in Alberta, then it means that maybe many of those entrepreneurial frontier types will switch from digging out the fossil fuels to tapping the geothermal sources of energy. So that's good news, is it not?
They'll be complaining along the way, but they'll get there.
That's the human prerogative, is to complain. So that's fine with me.
Thank you, John and John. Next is a question from Phil Riley, and Peter Bulkowski, you're on deck.
Okay, thank you. My background is one of, I'm going to call it civil disobedience and taking culprits to court. And so if I were to characterize your presentation, I think you were focusing on the individual, the role of the individual to change their behavior. And you were suggesting that there would have to be a system of laws that would be implemented. Well, from my experience, once you get into the legal system, you are doing nothing but delaying the whole process of undertaking activities. So that led me to sort of the question of how long would it take to establish the laws? And then you get to what would the process be to establish not just an equitable law, but a effective law. And I can see all kinds of interference from the people that have a vested interest in preventing that from happening. And, you know, in one of the cases where we were looking at the improvement of golf courses in a wetland, the end cost to that process was in the neighborhood of $3 million of court cases, 2 years worth of delay. And ultimately, the lawyer from the municipality said, oh, we didn't have to go through that process because the landowner had the right to do what he wanted anyway. And so I'm just thinking in terms of all of the implications of how do we get to where we want to go. And I think that a government has the ability through financial incentives to get people to act quicker than establishing laws and penalties.
Well, you're right that there are a lot of implications. I've been looking at over here in Europe. we've had about 20 years of trying to encourage people to reduce their carbon emissions. We've had various attempts at fuel taxes, taxes on gasoline, and those were a complete disaster. The United Kingdom government in the year 2000 increased the tax on gasoline for vehicle owners, and the country basically was shut down by the hauliers and truck drivers because they completely objected to this extra tax on gasoline and diesel. And in fact, more recently, President Macron tried the same thing in France, and he sparked a massive protest movement called the Gilets jaunes, which are the yellow jackets, and there's been tremendous backlash amongst consumers and citizens against these financial incentives. So I don't think that these 20 years of efforts by governments through financial incentives, I don't think they've been effective. I mean, they haven't been effective. The European Union has an emissions trading scheme, and that's been going now for 15 years. And the result of that is to reduce emissions from the various factories which are covered by this scheme. They've reduced emissions by 1% per year. That's absolutely pointless. We've got to reduce emissions by maybe 10% per year every year for the next 10 years. And people will have to understand that it is their legal responsibility to do this, and they must start taking it seriously. Now, how long it would take to set this whole scheme up with the necessary law, I think it would take 2 years. It would take 2 years to draft the law, put it through the parliaments, and for governments to start measuring the carbon footprints of their citizens. And at the same time, this world climate community could be established, and everything could be up and running within 2 years.
Thank you very much, John. I would like to now ask Peter Bolkowski to ask his question. I see, Peter, that you've got several questions.
Yes.
If you get the answers that you're looking for in short time, do go ahead with your next question. I think we can fit at least one more of your questions in before moving on to John Meyer, who will be on deck.
Okay. John, I'm a chemist, now retired, 40 some years in the oil and gas, living in Alberta. I have coworkers that are in their 50s, giving them half pay for 5 years and retraining them for what isn't going to cut it. They wouldn't be able to survive. They couldn't support their kids who can't afford houses anymore. Your amounts just don't make sense. I'll leave that as a comment. The question that I really would like you to answer, because to me, your solution says that the solution is a world government and a police force that will impose restrictions on the citizenry. Is that your solution? That's what I heard.
Okay, let's go back to the comment, because that's very interesting indeed. So my off-the-cuff proposal for half salary for 5 years won't cut it. What would cut it, Peter? What would bring these employees in the fossil fuel sector? What would bring them on board? What package would they accept?
They're going to need a salary that matches what they had till they hit retirement. And after retirement, they still may need a significant salary. The retraining, taking somebody that's 2 years out of university and retraining them into a different field is fine. Somebody that has 30 or 35 years in reservoir engineering, in production engineering, and so on, it doesn't work.
Okay. Okay, well, I mean, that will all have to be negotiated, but that's certainly an interesting starting point, and I agree. I mean, the package which is offered has to be attractive, otherwise it's pointless. Now, can you just remind me what was the question? Oh, about the world government.
What I heard for your solution to the problem is a world government and a police force that will impose these rules or restrictions on the citizenry.
Well, that's why this idea I have is very, very sensitive and very delicate. And your question is very pertinent. And that's why not everybody likes it. There will be people who say, no, this is George Orwell and it's Big Brother, and he's coming to control absolutely everything I do, and I won't have any say in the laws, and it's all going to be very dictatorial. Well, the experience of the EU is well, on the whole, it's quite positive. The EU is a very democratic organization, and no law can be made in the EU unless the governments agree. This is the governments of the 27 member states. They all have to agree to a law, and also the European Parliament has to agree. And no law can be passed unless those two legislative organs agree to a draft law. And the members of the European Parliament are elected every 5 years. There are about 700 of them. And they represent the citizens, and the citizens can go and see them any time. And so the European Union is not an anonymous, distant dictatorship. And I think any World Climate Union would have a similar nature. It would, and furthermore, another important point is the World Climate Union would only deal with climate. It doesn't deal with anything else. It doesn't deal with taxation. It doesn't deal with schools, hospitals, roads, industry, business, trade. Its remit is only climate.
But
and I think this might assuage the fears of those who believe that we're all going to be under the thumb of a distant and dictatorial regime.
Thank you for your answer, John.
We still have about 25 minutes, and we have a couple of more questions standing here waiting to be asked. And I just thought, while we had Peter Bolkowski talking, we would revert back to the comment made by John Hollins about the possibility of exploiting the geothermal under the southwest part of Alberta, where the Earth's crust is quite thin and access to considerable geothermal heat is available. Would there be any traction in your mind, Peter, to exploiting that with the skills and knowledge of the folks you've got working for you?
Okay, I'm glad you restricted it to the southwest corner of the province, because the geothermal energy across the rest requires really deep drilling and a process that has no possibility of financial viability. In the southwest of the province, you have a couple of problems, one of which is you're going to go in and you're going to punch a whole bunch of wells and pump a bunch of water down into parkland, national parks, provincial parks, and restricted land and ranch land. Okay, there are you could certainly convince the drilling engineers and the production engineers to go and do that. Whether you could get enough geothermal energy out shallow enough to make it viable, I don't know. But you can expect to have people chained across the roads and everything else before you would be able to move a single drilling rig into any of those areas. So maybe technically, maybe not, but certainly politically and in terms of the belief in protecting the environment and the natural habitat, you're fighting an uphill battles up to the top of Mount Everest.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to understand the reservations with regard to that idea. We have John Meyer with a question next, followed by Miles Flagg.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to add on to, or ask Peter a very quick question on geothermal in Western Alberta. How deep do you have to go there, Peter?
I don't know. I really don't know. It's going to be a kilometer or two down.
Yeah, at least. I mean, the wells I've looked at outside of Iceland require 3 or 4 kilometers, and no one can really do that yet. So anyway, okay, that was a quick question. My question, and another tangential comment, industries have been rising and falling in the Western world for decades, and they've been getting various levels of support. We collapsed the cod fishery here in Canada, and we had some level of public support for the fishermen and the other workers in the industry. But I think we're getting more sophisticated. Both Germany and Alberta have relatively sophisticated programs to look after their coal workers, which they're shutting down. So this isn't new territory. It may be new to all of us in detail, but these programs exist and they can be examined. My question, I see 3 mechanisms of reducing emissions. One is price, one is standards. You have to have standards so that you have a level playing field for all producers. Without standards, the lowest cost producer will always win, and that's part of the reason so much industry moved out of the OECD and into China, because China had very cheap but very dirty energy. And the third is incentives. But poor people, lower income people, tend to spend a higher proportion of their income on energy than do the well-to-do, even though the well-to-do might use a lot of energy. Do you have any mechanism in mind to establish any kind of what could be called energetic equality for various income groups?
No, I don't have any idea to equalize. Are you referring to an equalization of the amount of energy that people can consume? Is that the idea?
It's the percentage of their income they spend on energy. For instance, if you double the cost of electricity and natural gas in Canada, which we have to spend, we're a high consumption country, but that demand is much higher than inherently much higher than most other countries. You'd force people out onto the street, a lot of lower income people out onto the street. In the Netherlands, somehow, the percentage of income spent on energy is basically even across all income levels. And I have no idea how they did that, but it'd be worth studying. But here, the lower income people spend proportionately more of their income, and they can't really take a large cost increase for energy.
That's my observation as well. is that the poorer households spend a higher proportion of their income on the necessities of life, which include energy, which include food. Now, under my scheme, the price of energy would not increase. I would regard that everybody, I think it would work in practice by everybody would have a personal carbon budget. And so I would have a personal carbon budget next year of, say, 10 tons. And the following year, it would be 9 tons. And the following year after that, it would be 8 tons. And that would be the limit on the amount of greenhouse gases that I could emit during those 12 months. They would be gradually falling every year. And it wouldn't be done through price, because, as you rightly say, the poorest households, of which, and we have poor households in every country of the world, that would hit them very badly. And in fact, it was because of that the French, when President Macron tried to increase the taxation on diesel and gasoline, it was those people who went out on the streets and started turning over cars and torching cars and smashing up buildings, because the poorer people in the rural areas who rely upon their vehicles to get to the shops and get their children to the schools, they said, we can't afford to pay any higher prices for our petrol. We can't afford to pay more money for our gasoline. And they were the ones who protested so violently. So I would not propose increasing the price of energy.
If I could just step in and make a comment here. Ralph Torrey made a very good comment at a presentation I was attending. And he was saying that people will pay whatever rich people will pay whatever it takes to maintain comfort. And that means driving cars and keeping your house warm and what have you. You'll complain, but you'll pay it.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps one of the reasons why the in the EU, the raising of or adding carbon tax on gasoline was a failure, because people just said, well, I want the comfort, therefore I'm going to, swallow hard and carry on.
I think what Ralph Torres said is absolutely correct. In order for a government to induce its citizens to cut back on their fossil fuel consumption, the tax has to be very, very high indeed, because, as Ralph Torres says, people will pay whatever they can afford in order to maintain their existing lifestyle.
Thank you very much, John Meyer, and thank you, John McClintock. We have we have 5 more questions, and we've got about 14 minutes till 3 o'clock. So we'll start with Miles Flagg, and Zach, if you have a question, then would you please put yourself on deck?
Hello, John. My name's Miles, and I'm calling from Calgary, Alberta as well. And this is a city that just recently declared that the city finds itself indeed in a climate emergency. It'll be interesting to see how that changes. We were chatting about dandelions before coming on the call, and how they are actually delicious food, and you can make wine and salads out of them. So I would imagine I should not have to worry about dandelions, at least controlling them, nor mowing my lawn, if indeed this is a climate emergency. But I'm not very hopeful, because our city is going to be soon destroying a perfectly good Saddle Dome. It's our huge arena. They spent tens of millions of dollars just 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, fixing it up. 99% of the planet would say, are you crazy? You're going to destroy this perfectly good arena because the rich people want better boxes, those luxury sports boxes to view things from. But my question is, and I'll just say, I told City Hall people, I said, we're in a national climate emergency. We've been in a national climate emergency since 2019 or before. And that didn't seem to faze them that, oh, well. Anyway, question. In Canada, we convinced a lot of people that smoking is bad for their health. There's a lot of evidence, however, that meat and dairy are unhealthy. Personally and for the planet, we could stop deforestation and go pro-forestation if and only if we stop feeding 16 units of plant food to get 1 unit of meat. But like cigarettes, we have to believe that what I just shared. So my question is a poll question to everybody. Do you believe what I just said, and are you willing to change your diet?
Well, I believe. Well, hi, Miles. It's very kind of you to ask these questions, and it's great that you're from Calgary. I agree entirely with you. A meat-based diet is not a sensible way of feeding the world, and we have been eating in my family over here in Brussels. We originally, 10 years ago, we were having meat 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's because my wife, that's the way she used to live when she was a child. But now I'm pleased to say that we have about half. We've cut our consumption by about half. So, and over here in Europe, I don't know how it is in Canada, but over here in Europe, there are a lot of young people who not only have become vegetarian, but they've become vegan. And this has been an extraordinary change in dietary behavior. And we now have vegan restaurants, vegan shops, and veganism is really quite acceptable, and there's been a massive expansion. I'm not saying that everybody is now a vegan, but people are changing to vegetarianism and to veganism, not only because of climate change, but also because of reasons for animal welfare, because they regard the way that animals are raised on farms to be very cruel. So there is big change, big change over here.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you, John. Zach, I don't see you coming up, and I wonder if you're still there to ask your question. Are you reading?
Yes, I'm here and I read you.
Okay, so it'll be you to ask your question, and Martin Riddle, would you please put yourself in the box ready to follow?
To be perfectly honest, I didn't have a question. I was just trying to say I would adjust my diet, but not to be a full vegetarian, much less a vegan. That's not what I'm going to say, though. Since you've opened my mic, let me just make a snarky comment that among all you said there were a few people in Europe who weren't pleased about the EU. Yeah, some of them live in Britain, or lived. I don't need to tell you about that. But more seriously, I think that you're aiming this. If such a union developed, it would be among incumbent on governments to say that they will not allow the fossil fuels to be extracted, and then it would still be Canada saying, "What do you mean we're not going to extract our fuels, but all these other people are gonna?" But if they came together, they might actually agree. I don't know. But it's governments to other governments, governments to people, not so much. What governments have to do for people then is to make electrification plausible and to produce a proper electric grid or modular grids, as Art keeps telling us. And Well, frankly, as somebody else pointed out, you're not going to do this with renewables. You're really going to have to use nuclear, some geothermal if you can, but mainly nuclear. And I know that's not popular to say either. I'm not sure that's the question. I'm just more of a challenge.
Well, nuclear may well have a role. Geothermal may well have a role. I share the view of Professor Rees that renewables will not make a will not replace fossil fuels. I think that's technically not really plausible. But people will have to make changes to their lifestyles. They'll have to get out of their cars a little bit more. We'll have to get out the bicycles. We'll have to. I mean, a lot of people can make a very substantial reductions if they just downgrade from a heavy car to a light car. And those who are in light cars, maybe they can take public transport. It's not very difficult to reduce one's emissions initially. And these groups, which I spoke about at the beginning, these voluntary groups in the United Kingdom, which started up about 15 years ago, there were about 50 such voluntary groups of citizens who decided, well, because of the climate emergency, we must all reduce our emissions. Let's get together in a group and see what we can do. And these groups were studied very, very carefully for about 5 years. And it was found that in the first year alone, these groups were able to cut their emissions by 30%, by 1/3, just by making behavioral changes, by putting in some insulation or by cooking with a lid on the pot. And so it can be done.
I'm still saying, as long as governments are making gasoline, oil, diesel fuel, gas freely available and not that expensive, people aren't going to do it, but they will do it if the electricity is available and if there's nothing else available. But to make nothing else available, the government has to say, and boy, this would take gonads on the part of the government. No, fossil fuel industry, you are not allowed to do this. And the policing wouldn't be around the people. It would be around the fossil fuel executives, not even necessarily the workers, but the executives. Anyway, I'm sorry. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Zach. And I think we have about 4 minutes left, and I've got that many people with questions. So we'll start with Martin Riddle, and Art Hunter, if you still have a question, you're on deck. Could you just confirm that you want to ask a question, Art?
Yeah, I'll ask a question, not the one that I posted though.
All right then. And following that, we have Ted Manning and Jean Doherty. So Martin, you're on.
Fascinating, great presentation, thank you. I'm not going to delve into diets, but about pricing. How do you deal with the issue of getting the price for things correct in terms of trying to make changes to people's behavior?
I wouldn't use the price mechanism. I would let the price be determined by the free market. What I would do is to put a limit on the quantity of emissions that each family can produce. In other words, as I was saying before, my carbon footprint is, say, at the moment, it's probably about 10 tons. My obligation would be to reduce this from 10 tons to 9 tons in the following year. And after that to 8 tons in the following year, 7, 6, 5, as the years go by. So what I have to do, I have to be aware, well, what is causing these 10 tons of emissions? Is it the gas which I use for central heating in my house? Is it the diesel that I put in my Citroen vehicle? Or is it the gas which I use for cooking. I have to know what is causing these 10 tons. And then I have to reduce either the heating in my house by putting in insulation or by wearing a vest during the winter, or I have to reduce my consumption of diesel by not using my car so much and using some public transport, or by having a lighter car. So that is the mechanism by which I would reduce my consumption of fossil fuels. It's through a quantitative limit on my emissions, which means that if I limit my emissions, I have to limit my consumption of fossil fuels.
John, I don't agree with you. I think price is the driving mechanism for this. Living in an
Price?
apartment, having a car, I think I'm there already. Anyway, I'll move on.
Okay, well, we can discuss, but the pricing mechanism was tried by Tony Blair in the year 2000 and by President Macron in France. They said, put a tax on fossil fuels.
That's not a price.
That increased the price. But, you know, and the Swedes have the highest taxes in Europe, for highest taxes in the world for fossil fuels. They call them environmental taxes. They pay the cost of petrol and diesel in Sweden is the highest in the world, but it does not affect their driving behavior. They drive their cars just as much as anybody else because this tax is not at a high enough level. If it was 4 times what it is now, then perhaps they would get out of their cars and onto their bicycles. But to put it at 4 times the level, you're going to cause a lot of hardship to a lot of people. So my preference, my argument is that you don't use the price mechanism, you use a quantity mechanism.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you, John. Art, the floor is yours. And Art, do you wish to go on, or shall we end with you?
Yeah, I think we should end with me because we're at 90 minutes now. John, this is more of a rant than a question. I know that within your home, 83% of the energy that is consumed is heat energy. It is not electrical energy. But yet there seems to be an enormous interest in electricity only. I get my home energy for heating the house and the hot water from the ground, a shallow geothermal. And I think this focus on electricity only is totally wrong-headed. You shouldn't do that. We've got energy coming up from the center of the earth everywhere on the planet. You only have to go down a couple of meters and put a pipe in there and you got it. And so anyway, I just wanted to have that little rant. I don't expect you to respond, John, but it really bothers me.
Okay, well, I'll certainly take that on board, Art, and I'll point out in all my future lectures and presentations that geothermal energy is available and should be exploited.
Yes.
Well, John, this has been wonderful. We've reached our time limit of an hour and a half. I think you wanted feedback from some Canadians on your proposition, and I think you've succeeded. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree, Rick. And again, having worked with you on this proposal for the last few months, I found it extremely productive. I found this interaction with CACOR very, very constructive. I know that the idea is new, it's novel, and some people are frightened by it. I can well understand that. A lot of people were frightened about the European Union when it was first put forward as an idea. But the fact of the matter is the Keeling curve. The Keeling curve is on the up and up. And that is our bottom line. And we have to get control of it. So far, so many ideas have been put forward and they haven't worked. And so now we have to try a different idea. And to get the reaction of CACOR to this particular idea of mine, to form a world climate union, I think this has been very helpful to me.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd like to call on the president of CACOR, Jean Doherty.
Thank you, Rick. And John, thank you very much for a very interesting and certainly thought-provoking presentation. It has generated a lot of comments and a lot of dialogue on the chat function as well. So I really thank you very much for giving us this presentation. And I would like to invite everybody here who has come and listened to this to look at our CanadianCore.com, which is our website, where you can find all the information that you might want to with respect to this particular presentation. Once it is done and up on YouTube, you can find the link to that there. You will also be able to find the link to all of our other presentations that have been here on Zoom for the last year and a half. So you can look for those. And anybody who is interested in finding out more about the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I encourage you to go on the website and look for that, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There are so many opportunities for information there. So thank you again very much for your presentation. And I look forward to hearing some more discussion about this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jean. Thank you so much, everybody. That's been fascinating for me. And it's a new idea.